I gave birth to our first child, a beautiful baby boy named Ethan, just 6 weeks ago. The pregnancy was difficult, with severe morning sickness throughout and a long, complicated labor that ended in an emergency C-section. The recovery has been slow and painful, and I'm still dealing with all the physical and emotional challenges of the postpartum period, including some pretty intense sleep deprivation. My husband Mark has been supportive in his own way. He works full-time while I'm on maternity leave, and he does help with Ethan when he's home, but I've noticed that he doesn't quite grasp how exhausting and overwhelming these first weeks of motherhood have been for me. He makes comments like, "You get to stay home all day," as if I'm on some kind of vacation, not recovering from major surgery while keeping a newborn alive. This past Saturday, I was completely drained. Ethan had been cluster feeding all night, and I'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep total. By morning, I was a zombie. Mark got up around 8 a.m. and saw the state I was in. "You look terrible," he said, which wasn't exactly what I needed to hear. "Why don't you get some sleep? I'll take Ethan for a bit." I was too exhausted to even respond properly. I just nodded, fed Ethan one more time, and collapsed into bed. I don't even remember my head hitting the pillow. I was that tired. When I woke up, the house was silent. I checked my phone and was shocked to see it was already 2 p.m. I had slept for nearly 6 hours, which was by far the longest stretch of uninterrupted sleep I'd had since before Ethan was born. I felt groggy but more human than I had in weeks. Then I realized it was too quiet. I called out for Mark, but there was no answer. I got up and checked Ethan's bassinet, empty. I checked the living room, the kitchen, Mark's home office, no sign of either of them. I immediately called Mark's cell phone, no answer. I texted him, "Where are you and Ethan?" No response. At first, I tried to stay calm. Maybe they had just gone for a walk or to the store. But as the minutes ticked by with no word from Mark, my anxiety began to rise. Ethan was exclusively breastfed and had never gone more than 3 hours without eating. I checked our diaper bag and realized Mark hadn't taken it. No extra diapers, no change of clothes, no pacifiers. I called Mark's parents, thinking maybe he had taken Ethan to visit them. They hadn't seen him. I called his brother and his best friend. Nothing. By this point, I was in a full-blown panic. My 6-week-old baby was somewhere unknown without the supplies he needed, and my husband wasn't answering his phone. At 3:30 p.m., a full hour and a half after I'd woken up, I called the police. I explained the situation, that my husband had taken our newborn son without telling me where they were going, without taking essential supplies, and wasn't responding to calls or texts. The officer took the information and said they would send someone to take a report. As I waited for the police to arrive, my mind went to the darkest places. What if they'd been in an accident? What if Mark had done something to harm Ethan? What if they were never coming back? I know these thoughts might seem extreme, but the combination of postpartum hormones, sleep deprivation, and genuine fear for my baby's safety had me spiraling. 2 officers arrived around 4 p.m. and took my statement. They were kind and seemed to take the situation seriously, especially when I emphasized that Ethan was only 6 weeks old and needed to eat every 2 or 3 hours. They put out an alert for Mark's car and said they would start making calls to local hospitals to check for accidents. At 4:45 p.m., just as the officers were about to leave, Mark pulled into the driveway with Ethan. He looked shocked to see police cars outside our house. I ran out and grabbed Ethan from his car seat, fighting back tears of relief as I checked him over. He seemed fine but was clearly hungry, rooting against my chest. The officers asked to speak with Mark, and I took Ethan inside to feed him. I could hear Mark's raised voice from the porch, sounding indignant and defensive. When the police finally left and Mark came inside, he was fuming. "I can't believe you called the cops on me for taking my son out for a few hours," he said, glaring at me. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? My neighbors saw the police cars. What are they going to think?" I was feeding Ethan, who was gulping hungrily, and I felt my own anger rising to match his. "You took our 6-week-old baby somewhere without telling me, without taking any supplies, and ignored all my calls and texts for hours. What was I supposed to think?" "I didn't ignore your calls," he said defensively. "My phone died, and I left a note on the kitchen counter." I blinked in surprise. "What note? There was no note." Mark stomped into the kitchen and pointed at a small piece of paper that had fallen behind the toaster. Sure enough, it was a hastily scribbled note. "Taking Ethan to the game at Dave's. Back later." Dave's? I repeated, feeling my blood pressure rise. You took our newborn to Dave's house to watch a football game in the middle of a pandemic? Mark rolled his eyes. It was just Dave and his wife, and his brother, and a couple guys from work. It's not like it was a huge party. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. So you took our 6-week-old, who has basically no immune system, to a gathering with multiple people outside our household without discussing it with me first? Without taking diapers or extra clothes or anything he might need? He was fine, Mark insisted. Dave's wife helped out. She has kids. And you couldn't answer your phone because it died, I continued, trying to keep my voice steady for Ethan's sake. But you were gone for almost 9 hours. You didn't think to borrow someone else's phone to let me know you were okay? Mark had the grace to look slightly embarrassed at that. I didn't realize how long we'd been gone. The game went into overtime and then we were just hanging out. I figured you needed the sleep. I needed to know where my baby was, I said, feeling tears welling up. I was terrified, Mark. I thought something terrible had happened to you both. So your solution was to call the police? He asked, his voice rising again. They treated me like I was some kind of criminal. Dave's neighbors saw them questioning me in his driveway. I'll probably get fired if my boss finds out about this. I tried everything else first, I defended myself. I called everyone I could think of. What else was I supposed to do? Mark didn't answer that. Instead, he grabbed his keys. I need some air. I'm going out. Where are you going? I asked, alarmed that he was leaving again so soon. Does it matter? You're not my keeper, he snapped and slammed the door behind him. He didn't come home until after midnight. The next morning, he was still giving me the cold shoulder, answering my questions with one-word responses. When his mother called around noon, he eagerly took the phone and went into another room. I could hear fragments of his conversation, enough to realize he was telling her his version of events, painting me as a hysterical, overprotective mother who had overreacted to an innocent father-son outing. An hour later, my phone started blowing up with messages from his family. His mother called me controlling and said I needed to let Mark be a father too. His sister texted that I had humiliated Mark and owed him a public apology. Even his aunt, whom I'd only met twice, chimed in on Facebook to say that some mothers think they're the only ones who can take care of a baby and that I should trust the father's instincts too. By evening, I was a wreck. Mark was still barely speaking to me, his family was attacking me from all sides, and I was beginning to wonder if I really had overreacted. Maybe I should have looked harder for a note. Maybe I should have waited longer before calling the police. Maybe this was just normal new parent anxiety amplified by hormones and exhaustion. But then my own mother called. I hadn't told her about the incident yet, not wanting to worry her or bias her against Mark, but apparently his mother had reached out to express concern about my mental state. I broke down and told her everything. How Mark had taken Ethan without proper supplies, how he'd gone to a gathering during a pandemic, how he'd been unreachable for hours, how scared I had been, how hard I had tried to locate them before involving authorities. How he and his family were now making me feel like I was crazy for being worried. My mother listened quietly, then said, "Honey, you did exactly what any responsible mother would do. If someone took my 6-week-old and disappeared for hours, I would have called the police too, and probably a SWAT team." Her validation broke the dam, and I cried with relief. Maybe I wasn't crazy after all. When I repeated my mother's words to Mark that night, hoping to make him understand my perspective, he scoffed, "Of course your mother would take your side, but everyone else thinks you overreacted." "Not everyone," I countered. "The police didn't think I was overreacting. They took it very seriously." "Because you probably hyped it up and made me sound like some kind of kidnapper," he shot back. "I'm his father. I have every right to take him places." "Yes, you're his father," I agreed, "but we're his parents. Together, which means we communicate about where we're taking him, especially when he's this young and especially during a global pandemic, and we make sure the other parent can reach us in case of emergency." Mark just shook his head. "You're being dramatic. Nothing happened to him. He was perfectly safe." "This time," I said quietly, "but what about next time? What if he had gotten sick? What if there had been an emergency and I couldn't reach you?" "There won't be a next time," Mark said. "Not if you're going to call the cops every time I want to take my son somewhere." The conversation went in circles after that, neither of us willing to concede. Mark sees the incident as me not trusting him as a father and humiliating him publicly. I see it as him being irresponsible with our newborn's safety and dismissing my legitimate concerns. It's been 5 days now, and things are still tense between us. Mark's family continues to send passive-aggressive messages about how I need to trust Mark's parenting and stop being so controlling. My own family and friends are firmly on my side, insisting that any parent would have been terrified in my situation and that Mark was being thoughtless at best, negligent at worst. Mark is sleeping in the guest room, saying he needs space. He helps with Ethan when I ask directly, but he's not volunteering anymore. Last night he mentioned that he's thinking of going to stay with his brother for a while until things calm down. I'm exhausted, physically and emotionally. The lack of sleep, the postpartum recovery, the constant feeding and changing and soothing of a newborn, it's all hard enough without this added stress. I feel like I'm failing at everything, as a mother, as a wife, as a person who can make rational decisions. Part of me wonders if I did overreact. If I had looked harder for the note before panicking. If I should have waited another hour before calling the police. If my postpartum hormones clouded my judgment. Maybe Mark is right and I embarrassed him unnecessarily. But another part of me feels like he's not acknowledging how scared I was, how irresponsible it was to take a newborn to a gathering during a pandemic, how inconsiderate it was to be unreachable for so many hours. A simple "I'm sorry I worried you" would go a long way, but he seems incapable of seeing my perspective. My sister says I should consider couples therapy, but Mark is resistant to the idea, saying we don't need strangers in our business. My best friend thinks I should take Ethan and go stay with my parents until Mark grows up and apologizes. Mark's mother called yesterday to suggest I might have postpartum depression and should get help before it affects my ability to be a good mother. I don't know what to do. I don't want my marriage to fall apart when our son is just 6 weeks old, but I also don't want to apologize for something I don't think was wrong. I was terrified for my baby's safety, and I took what felt like the necessary steps to ensure he was okay after exhausting other options. So, I'm turning to you for perspective. Was calling the police an extreme overreaction to my husband taking our son out for a day? Should I have waited longer, looked harder for a note, assumed they were fine despite having no way to confirm it? Was I being a controlling mother who doesn't trust her husband to parent? Or was I a concerned parent with legitimate reasons to worry about my newborn's whereabouts? Am I the a-hole?